The millionaire boss's twins were deaf, till new black cleaner did something that changed everything. The city never really slept, though from the windows of the Callahan estate, perched high upon the northern hillside where ancient oaks stretched their arms above stone walls and electric gates, it often seemed as though the world below existed on some other plane entirely, as if the traffic, the neon, the cacophony of horns and shouts belonged to a separate universe that could not pierce the tranquility of such wealth. Inside that grand mansion of polished marble and chandeliers, of sprawling hallways and windows tall as cathedral arches, lived the Callahan family. Though to many outsiders, it often appeared that only one figure truly mattered within its walls. Alexander Callahan, the man whose name had been printed in every financial magazine across the country, the man who had built an empire of investment firms, tech startups, and luxury real estate holdings, all consolidated under a surname that now carried weight wherever it was spoken. Yet behind those shining windows, beyond the image of power and unshakable success, resided a truth not often whispered outside the gates. For Alexander, despite the riches that glittered like stars within his reach, carried a sorrow that wealth could not mend, a sorrow embodied in the fragile figures of his twin children, Noah and Eliana. They were 6 years old, small, pale, with dark curls inherited from their late mother, and eyes that seemed always to search for something they could never fully grasp. Born prematurely, they had struggled from the very beginning, and though their bodies grew, their ears never did what nature intended them to do. The world for them was silent, vast, and at times frightening. They communicated through signs and expressions, their laughter visible but soundless, their tears falling without a sob. For years, Alexander had brought specialists from across continents, had invested in the finest medical devices, had hosted consultations with renowned surgeons and therapists, each promising with some new experimental procedure or costly treatment a flicker of hope that the silence might one day be broken. But year after year, those hopes had waned like dying embers, and his twins, while deeply loved, remained locked in their soundless existence. Some nights Alexander stood at the edge of their beds, watching their small chests rise and fall in sleep, and though he was a man celebrated for his decisiveness and relentless will, he would feel himself unravel, powerless, unable to purchase or negotiate the one thing he truly wanted. It was during one of those restless seasons, when the mansion had grown colder not from lack of heat but from lack of warmth, that she arrived. Her name was Amara Johnson, though on the employment papers it was simply listed as cleaner, evening shift. She had come to the estate through an agency that rarely supplied staff to such wealthy homes, and perhaps it was only due to the sudden departure of the previous cleaning team that she found herself walking through the iron gates, her modest shoes clicking against the polished stone path. Amara was in her late 20s, a woman whose presence carried both quiet dignity and a kind of resilience born not from privilege but from struggle. Her skin, the color of mahogany polished by the sun, contrasted with the cream walls and gilded furniture of the Callahan residence. And when she first entered those vast halls with her mop and her bucket, her eyes widened slightly, though she quickly composed herself, as if she had stepped into many such houses before. On her first evening, Alexander did not notice her. He was locked in his office, arguing over conference calls, his voice sharp and clipped, as though each sentence were another battle in an endless war for dominance. The twins were with their governess, a stern woman in gray, who communicated with them through sign language but without much tenderness, her expression stiff, her patience limited. Yet it was in the small details that destiny began to stir. As Amara cleaned the playroom, her movements unhurried but thorough, she glanced at Noah and Eliana, who sat on the carpet pushing silent toy cars across the rug, and something in her softened. She crouched down, though she was not expected to engage with them, and for a moment simply observed the way their eyes flickered, quick and intelligent, the way their fingers shaped words without sound. "Hello," she whispered, though she knew they could not hear. Then, remembering something, she began to gesture, her hands forming clumsy but recognizable signs. "My name is Amara." The twins' eyes widened. They exchanged a quick glance. Then their little fingers signed back, hesitant but clear. "You know signs?" Amara smiled. "A little," she signed, her motions not elegant but earnest. "I learned some years ago." And so the first thread was woven. The governess, frowning from the doorway, reminded Amara of her duties, and the moment ended quickly. Yet the children's eyes followed her as she left. Something kindled within them that had not been there before. That night, when Alexander checked on them before bed, he noticed they were restless, whispering to each other in their silent language more animatedly than usual. He assumed it was a sugar rush from dessert or some childish excitement, and thought little of it. Days turned into a week, and Amara's presence in the mansion became steady, like a quiet pulse. She worked diligently, polishing the grand staircases, sweeping through halls that seemed too large for any human soul. Yet always, in the corner of her awareness, she carried the memory of the twins' faces lighting up when she signed to them. She had not told anyone the truth, that she had grown up with a younger cousin who had been deaf, and through years of patience and love, had learned how to communicate with him when the rest of the family had struggled. She knew what it meant to live in silence, to crave connection, and she recognized the same longing in Noah and Eliana. One evening, while Alexander hosted a meeting in the grand dining hall, Amara found herself again near the playroom. The governess had stepped away, and the twins sat with their toys, looking bored. Amara hesitated, then walked in, wiping her hands on the edge of her apron. "Would you like to play?" she signed, her movements careful. Their faces brightened instantly. They nodded eagerly, and for the next half hour, the cleaner and the millionaire's children built block towers and laughed. Though their laughter was silent, Amara could feel it, see it in the sparkle of their eyes, the rhythm of their gestures, the way their bodies shook with joy. But it was more than play. Amara began to show them something subtle, something their governess never had patience for: rhythm, movement, vibration. She tapped the wooden blocks on the floor in patterns, letting them feel the vibrations through their palms, encouraging them to mimic the rhythm with their own hands. They watched her intently, their expressions curious, and slowly, almost shyly, they tapped back. That was the beginning of something that none of them yet understood. And in the hallway, unseen, Alexander Callahan paused, his hand tightening on the doorframe as he watched the scene through the crack in the door, a frown shadowing his face. Not out of anger, but out of bewilderment. For years, his children had seemed withdrawn, unreachable, yet here they were, glowing, alive, engaging with a woman who was not a specialist, not a therapist, not a governess. Merely a cleaner, hired to sweep the dust from his mansion. He did not step inside. He simply stood there, the weight of confusion heavy upon him, wondering if perhaps, just perhaps, there were things that money could never buy, but that might still be found in the most unexpected places. The following days in the Callahan mansion unfolded with the strange air of subtle transformation, as though invisible threads had been pulled and the fabric of daily life was quietly rearranging itself. Amara still arrived each evening with her modest bag, her uniform pressed but plain, her shoes softened by years of wear. Yet now the air in the great house seemed to shift whenever she entered. It was not something Alexander acknowledged aloud, nor did the staff whisper it directly. But even the butler noticed how the twins waited expectantly near the playroom door at the hour when they knew the cleaner would pass through. The governess, Mrs. Whitmore, frowned at this new attachment, her lips tightening in disapproval whenever she caught Amara crouching on the carpet, her fingers moving in clumsy yet tender signs. She had always believed that her role as governess was to instruct, to impose discipline, to keep the twins within the structure of lessons and routines, not to indulge them with games that carried no official educational merit. Yet her protests were subtle at first, for she knew the Callahan household did not tolerate open conflict among the staff, and Alexander himself seemed distracted, as always, by the empire he balanced with relentless focus. But Alexander was not blind. Each night, when he passed by the playroom on his way to his office or the wine cellar, he saw the difference in his children's faces. Where before there had been a certain dullness to their expressions, a heaviness that no toy nor lavish holiday trip had managed to lift, now there was light energy, even stubborn defiance when the governess tried to pull them away from their time with Amara. He watched Noah mimic the rhythm Amara drummed with her fingertips on the floorboards, and he saw Eliana pressing her ear gently against the wooden table, trying to catch some echo of vibration, as if some forgotten door to the world of sound might tremble open. One evening, Alexander could no longer remain only an observer. He stepped fully into the playroom, his tall figure framed by the doorway, and his voice, smooth, commanding, accustomed to being heard, filled the space. "What exactly is going on in here?" Amara startled, though she tried to compose herself quickly, standing up and brushing her palms on her apron. "Just keeping them company, sir," she said softly, though she knew well enough that Alexander Callahan was not a man easily satisfied with vague explanations. The twins, however, rushed to his side, tugging at his sleeve, their hands flying in a flurry of signs. "She plays with us. She shows us new things. We like her." Alexander's eyes, sharp and penetrating, flicked from his children to the cleaner. "They seem different," he said slowly, not unkindly but with the puzzled tone of a man and used to mysteries he could not solve with logic or resources. "Happier, more alive. What are you doing that their governess or their therapists haven't managed in 6 years?" Amara hesitated. She could have brushed it aside, claimed it was nothing, but something in his gaze demanded honesty. "I grew up with someone who couldn't hear," she admitted, her voice low but steady. "My cousin. He was younger than me, and the world often treated him as if he were less, as if silence meant emptiness. But it doesn't. It just means you find another way. I learned with him how to sign, how to help him feel sound through touch and rhythm. It made him smile, it made him connect. I thought, maybe your children could feel the same." The silence that followed was heavier than the marble floors beneath them. Alexander studied her, his expression unreadable, the calculating stillness of a man accustomed to measuring risk and opportunity. Finally, he inclined his head, just slightly. "You are not employed here to teach or to play," he said, though his voice lacked sharpness. "But I cannot deny what I see. Continue if it pleases them. We will discuss this later." He left then, his footsteps echoing down the hall, but his mind was restless. He did not like leaving matters unexplained, nor did he enjoy feeling indebted to chance. Yet he could not erase the look of joy in his children's eyes, nor the warmth with which they clung to a stranger they had known scarcely 2 weeks. That night, long after the house had quieted and even the staff had retreated to their quarters, Alexander poured himself a glass of brandy in his private study and sat in the leather chair his father once favored. He turned the amber liquid in his hand, staring into it as if it held answers. His empire was built on certainties, projections, numbers, contracts signed in ink. But what certainty was there in the way Amara had walked into his children's silence and stirred something no world-renowned doctor had managed to reach? Meanwhile, in her small apartment across the river, Amara sat on the edge of her bed, replaying the day in her mind. She had not meant to attract attention. In truth, she had feared it. But she could not resist the twins' eager eyes, nor the way they seemed to breathe more deeply when they were understood without judgment. She thought of her cousin again, of the nights they had stayed up tapping rhythms on the wall between their rooms, and she smiled, though a flicker of unease touched her. For she knew from experience that the wealthy often looked upon those like her as temporary, replaceable, a passing utility, not as someone who might alter their lives. The next day brought confirmation of her unease. Mrs. Whitmore intercepted her in the corridor with that pinched expression of disapproval. "The children are growing attached to you in ways that are not appropriate," she said stiffly, her voice a clipped whisper. "It is not your role to encourage such familiarity. You are here to clean, not to intrude upon their education." Amara met her gaze calmly, though her heart tightened. If giving them joy and helping them feel less alone is intrusion, then I suppose I am guilty. But perhaps you should ask them what they need, not only what you think they should have. The governess's cheeks flushed with indignation, but before she could retort, Noah and Eliana appeared in the hallway, their little fingers already moving in swift signs. "Don't be angry. She helps us. We love when she stays." Whitmore's lips pressed into a thin line, and she retreated, though not without a final glare at Amara. The children laughed silently, tugging at Amara's hand, pulling her toward the playroom once more. And as Amara followed them, she realized something. The mansion was not nearly as cold as it had first seemed. Somewhere deep inside, a warmth was beginning to grow, not only for the children, but for the father who watched from shadows, a man who perhaps needed saving in ways he did not yet know. What Amara could not yet see, however, was that the path she had stepped onto was no simple path of kindness. It was a path that would entangle her life with Alexander Callahan's in ways neither of them could predict. A path that would demand not only compassion, but courage. For when power and vulnerability collide, the world often tests both. And already the test was quietly unfolding. The weeks that followed seemed to carry a rhythm of their own, as if the Callahan estate itself had begun to breathe differently, its silence no longer heavy with sorrow but charged with the quiet hum of change. Noah and Eliana, once withdrawn and prone to drifting into their private worlds of drawings and solitary play, were now brimming with a vitality that astonished even the house staff. They clapped their hands to feel vibrations. They tapped spoons against tabletops to create patterns they could share with Amara. And they had begun to communicate in signs so animated that even those who did not understand the language could guess their joy. It was not long before whispers reached Alexander through the housekeepers and the butler, that the twins no longer asked for their governess first thing in the morning, but instead signed eagerly for Amara's presence, even when they knew her shifts began late in the day. The children had never shown such stubborn preference for anyone other than their late mother, and it unsettled him, though he could not deny the warmth it stirred deep within his chest. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of negotiations and calls that stretched across time zones, Alexander arrived home to find his children sitting at the grand dining table, waiting. They had refused their meal until Amara could sit with them. It was an unusual request, one the chef and staff found awkward, but the twins' resolve was unshakable. When Amara finally appeared, her hair tied back, her hands slightly rough from work, they clapped excitedly, tugging her into a chair between them as though she had always belonged there. Alexander, standing at the head of the table, watched this scene unfold. The long dining hall, usually echoing with stiff formality, felt transformed by the small, domestic intimacy of his children's laughter. Laughter without sound, but so real, so alive, it filled the room more than any conversation ever had. He took his seat slowly, his gaze resting on Amara. She lowered her eyes, uncomfortable with the attention, but continued to engage the twins, signing with gentle patience, correcting their mistakes with encouragement rather than criticism. Alexander found himself strangely captivated. After the meal, when the twins had been ushered off by Mrs. Whitmore for bedtime rituals. Alexander lingered in the dining hall. Amara, stacking plates to carry back toward the kitchen, glanced up when he spoke. "You've changed this house," he said, his tone not accusing, not even questioning, but contemplative, as though speaking more to himself than to her. Amara straightened slightly, her fingers tightening on the porcelain. "I've done nothing extraordinary, sir," she replied softly. "I've only given them what they were already searching for, a connection. They don't want perfection, they just want someone to see them." Alexander studied her for a long moment, the amber glow of the chandelier catching in his eyes. "Do you realize," he said slowly, "that I have spent millions, more than most people will see in their lifetimes, trying to bring them even a fraction of the joy you've managed to give without spending a cent?" Her breath caught, though she tried not to show it. "Sometimes money builds walls," she said carefully. "Not on purpose, perhaps, but still walls. Children don't see the value of wealth the way adults do. They only see whether you reach out your hand, whether you listen, whether you care." His jaw tightened, though not in anger, rather in a kind of resistance against truths he was unaccustomed to hearing. "Care is not always enough," he murmured, almost as if to himself. "I cared. Their mother cared. And yet—" He broke off, his voice roughening, his eyes shifting away. Amara lowered her gaze, realizing she had touched upon a wound still raw beneath his composed exterior. She wanted to say more, but she knew better than to press. Instead, she inclined her head and gathered the dishes, her silence both respectful and heavy with unspoken compassion. But later that night, when Alexander stood at the doorway of the twins' room, he noticed something remarkable. Noah had pressed a small toy drum against Eliana's chest, tapping lightly, and she giggled, her small hands clapping as though she could almost hear. Alexander froze, the sight cutting deep into him with a mix of wonder and grief. Could it be possible, he thought, that all along, the answer had not been in surgical theaters or medical breakthroughs, but in something as simple as teaching them to feel rhythm, to let sound be experienced through the body instead of the ears? It unsettled him more than any hostile takeover or failed negotiation ever had, because it meant that perhaps, for all his intelligence and resources, he had been blind to what his children truly needed. Meanwhile, tensions within the household began to swell. Mrs. Whitmore grew increasingly bitter, her authority undermined each time the twins turned to Amara instead of her. More than once, she cornered Alexander privately, her tone sharp but cloaked in professional restraint. "Mr. Callahan," she said one afternoon, her hands folded primly in front of her. "The cleaner has overstepped her boundaries in ways I cannot condone. The children's attachment to her is unhealthy, and frankly, it disrupts their education. If this continues, I cannot fulfill my duties properly." Alexander listened, his face inscrutable, and when she finished, he said simply, "Perhaps what they need cannot be found in your duties alone." Mrs. Whitmore stiffened, her lips parting as though to protest, but she swallowed it, recognizing the dismissal in his tone. Yet, as she walked away, her expression hardened with a quiet promise that she would not let this go unchallenged. Amara sensed this hostility but bore it silently, unwilling to risk drawing attention to herself or jeopardizing her position. She needed this job desperately, though she never spoke of why. It was more than income. It was survival. It was the chance to keep her own younger brother in school, to pay the medical bills for her aunt who had raised her, to keep the fragile structure of her life from collapsing. If Mrs. Whitmore succeeded in turning Alexander against her, she could lose everything. But each time Noah and Eliana pulled her into their games, each time they beamed with pride when they managed to mimic a rhythm or sign a sentence without mistake, she knew she could not step back, no matter the risk. For once in her life, she felt her presence mattered beyond the tasks of sweeping floors and polishing furniture. Here, in this mansion of marble and glass, she was not invisible. She was seen, not only by two small children who adored her, but perhaps, in fleeting glances and measured words, by their father as well. And though she would never admit it aloud, something about the way Alexander's eyes lingered when he watched her with his children stirred a warmth within her that she both welcomed and feared. Because she had not come here to entangle her life with a man like him, a man whose world was carved from power and privilege. She had come simply to work. But life, she was beginning to understand, rarely unfolded according to the plans we make for ourselves. And somewhere in the quiet corners of the mansion, unseen and unspoken, Mrs. Whitmore began to plan her own move, one that would soon test the fragile bond that had begun to form between Amara, the twins, and the man who still wrestled with his grief. The mansion, with its endless wings and polished silence, had always felt like a fortress, imposing, unassailable, a monument to Alexander Callahan's unyielding will. Yet lately, the air within those grand halls carried tension so palpable that even the butler, who had served 3 generations of Callahans without once flinching under household dramas, found himself walking more cautiously, as though afraid to step into the invisible line of fire between the governess and the cleaner. Mrs. Whitmore's discontent had grown into quiet bitterness, each day sharpening her conviction that Amara's influence over the twins was dangerous, inappropriate, and perhaps even threatening to her own place in the household. She had been hired for her impeccable resume, her years of experience with children of the wealthy elite, her mastery of schedules and discipline. Yet now she found herself competing with a woman who came armed with no qualifications beyond empathy and resilience, and the sting of it gnawed at her pride like acid on stone. Amara, for her part, tried to avoid conflict, focusing instead on the twins' progress. Noah had begun to tap rhythms so confidently that he could mimic songs she played softly on her phone, holding the device against his palms to catch the vibrations. Eliana, shy and reserved by nature, had blossomed into a child who signed elaborate stories at bedtime, her face animated, her eyes bright. To see them thrive filled Amara with a joy she could not explain. Yet with every smile they gave her, a small shadow of fear tugged at her heart, reminding her that she did not truly belong in this world of chandeliers and sprawling staircases, that at any moment the fragile privilege of being here could be snatched away. It was one evening, after a long day of rain that left the mansion's windows streaked with silver, when the simmering conflict finally boiled over. Amara had just finished helping the twins build a tower of wooden blocks in the playroom, their hands flying in laughter as they exaggerated each wobble and crash. Alexander entered quietly, leaning against the doorway, his expression soft in a way that surprised even him. For a man whose life was dominated by numbers, contracts, and relentless control, to watch his children this alive felt like a miracle he dared not interrupt. But Mrs. Whitmore interrupted for him. She appeared suddenly, her heels striking the polished floor with sharp finality. Her voice clipped as she said, "This must stop at once." The twins froze, their smiles faltering. Amara rose to her feet, sensing the storm. "What exactly must stop, Mrs. Whitmore?" Alexander's voice was calm, though it carried that undercurrent of command that reminded everyone present who held authority in this house. The governess drew herself up, her hands clasped in front of her. "This constant intrusion, this cleaner," she spat the word with subtle disdain, "has overstepped every boundary of her employment. The children cling to her in ways that are unhealthy. They refuse to follow lessons properly. They delay meals. They ignore me entirely unless she is present. This is not structure, Mr. Callahan. It is chaos, and it is damaging." Amara's chest tightened, but she kept her head bowed, unwilling to defend herself against accusations that might only make matters worse. Yet before she could speak, Eliana tugged at her father's sleeve, her small fingers flying in urgent signs. Not damaging. We are happy. She helps us. We learn more with her than with anyone else. Noah signed furiously beside her, his face determined. Don't take her away. Alexander's jaw clenched as he watched his children. He turned his gaze to Whitmore, whose face flushed with indignation at being contradicted by 6-year-olds. Perhaps, Alexander said slowly, what you call chaos is simply connection, and perhaps what they need is not more discipline but more humanity. Whitmore stiffened, her eyes narrowing. With respect, sir, you are allowing sentiment to blind you. This woman has no qualifications, no training. Do you truly believe she knows better than years of specialists? Alexander's voice dropped into that dangerous calm that had unsettled countless boardrooms. What I believe, he said, his gaze unwavering, is what I see with my own eyes, and what I see is my children smiling, truly smiling, for the first time in years. The silence that followed was deafening. Whitmore's lips pressed into a thin line, her composure cracking just enough for her resentment to show. She gave a curt nod, spun on her heel, and left the room without another word. The twins immediately rushed to Amara, hugging her waist as if afraid she might vanish. Alexander watched them for a long moment before finally speaking, his voice low, almost reluctant. I've never seen them fight for someone like that. Not even for their therapists. Not even for me. Amara's heart ached at the vulnerability in his tone. She wanted to reassure him, to remind him that children did not choose based on wealth or titles, but simply on who made them feel safe and loved. Yet all she said was, "They love you, Mr. Callahan. Don't ever doubt that. But sometimes, they just need someone who meets them where they are, not where the world expects them to be." Their eyes met then, and for a moment the walls between them, the walls of wealth and class, of power and humility, seemed to thin. Alexander's gaze lingered, not with the sharp scrutiny of a businessman, but with the searching uncertainty of a man who had carried too much alone for too long. He broke it first, straightening, clearing his throat. You should rest. It's late. Tomorrow will be another long day. Amara nodded, though her chest still thrummed with the unspoken weight of his words. That night, however, Mrs. Whitmore did not rest. In her private quarters, she paced furiously, her pride wounded, her authority undermined. It was not merely jealousy, it was fear. She had built her reputation on being indispensable. Yet now she felt herself slipping, overshadowed by a woman she considered unworthy. And in the shadows of her resentment, a decision began to form, one that would soon shake the fragile balance of the household. Meanwhile, Alexander stood at the balcony outside his study, staring at the city lights sprawled beneath the hill like a map of fireflies. He thought of his late wife, of her laughter, of how she had once said that money could build a life but never a home. For years he had dismissed those words as sentimentality. But now, as he thought of his children's joy in Amara's presence, he wondered if perhaps she had been right all along. And Amara, lying awake in her small apartment, stared at the cracked ceiling, torn between gratitude for the bond she had built with the twins and fear that it might all be taken away. For she could sense that forces were gathering against her, and she did not know if Alexander Callahan would truly stand on her side when the storm broke. But one thing was certain: the storm was coming. The storm broke on a Thursday evening, when the sky outside the Callahan estate was bruised with thunderclouds, and the first heavy drops of rain struck against the tall windows like restless fingers. Inside, the mansion was unusually tense for Mrs. Whitmore, having decided that subtlety had failed her, acted with a final desperate boldness. She had contacted Alexander directly in the middle of his board call, her tone icy, her message sharp. Amara was unsuitable for the children, not only because of her lack of qualifications, but because of where she came from, the background she represented. She had not used the word race outright, but the venom was unmistakable, the prejudice thinly veiled beneath her polished diction. Alexander's anger was not immediate. It was slow, controlled, the kind of anger that smoldered beneath the skin. He ended the call with his board, summoned Whitmore to his office, and demanded she repeat her words. She did so with defiance, standing tall, her hands folded primly, as though convinced that she was only voicing what any reasonable employer of status ought to consider. But what she failed to anticipate was that Alexander Callahan, for all his cold exterior, had lived long enough to recognize injustice when it stared him in the face. He thought of Amara, of her patience, her dignity, the way she had lifted his children from despair without asking for anything in return, and he realized in that moment that he could not and would not tolerate such poison in his home. "You are dismissed, Mrs. Whitmore," he said, his voice calm yet final, the tone of a man who never reversed his decisions. "Collect your things and leave tonight. I will not have my children raised under the shadow of prejudice." For the first time since her arrival, Whitmore faltered, her composure cracking into disbelief. "Sir, you cannot mean—" "I mean exactly what I said," Alexander interrupted, his eyes like steel. "And if you think that wealth or status excuses such small-minded cruelty, then you've misunderstood me entirely. Leave." She left, her pride shattered, her heels clattering against the marble floor as if echoing her downfall. But in the playroom down the hall, Noah and Eliana had seen more than they were meant to. They had watched the exchange through the open doorway, their young minds quick to understand the sting of rejection even if the words themselves escaped them. When Amara entered moments later, their little hands flew anxiously in signs. "Are you leaving too? Will they take you away?" Amara dropped to her knees, pulling them close, her heart breaking at their fear. "No," she signed, tears glistening in her eyes. "I'm not going anywhere." And behind her, Alexander stood, watching the scene unfold with a heaviness that finally gave way to clarity. He had been blind for so long, chasing treatments, investing in sterile solutions, while the true miracle had stood in front of him in the form of a woman who had nothing but love and resilience to give. That night, he asked her to join him in the study after the children slept. She came reluctantly, wiping her hands on her apron, uncertain of what awaited her. "Sit," he said gently, and for the first time, there was no command in his voice, only invitation. She sat. Alexander leaned forward, his hands folded, his eyes fixed on hers. "You've given my children something no doctor, no therapist, no governess could. You gave them joy, confidence, hope. And you've given me something too, reminded me of what it means to be more than a provider, to be present, to be human. I owe you more than I can express." Amara lowered her gaze, her voice trembling. "I didn't do it for gratitude. I only wanted them to feel seen. Too many children like them, too many people like me, are told they don't belong. Couldn't let them believe that." Her words struck him deeper than any boardroom speech, any investor pitch. Slowly, Alexander reached across the table, his hand resting near hers, not touching, but close enough that the gesture itself was profound. "Stay," he said, "not just as a cleaner. Stay as part of this family, if you'll allow it." The weight of the moment pressed heavily between them, yet it was not suffocating. It was liberating. Amara's eyes lifted, meeting his, and though she did not answer with words, The softness of her smile and the quiet determination in her gaze were answer enough. From that day forward, the Callahan mansion was never again the cold, silent fortress it had once been. It was filled with rhythm, hands tapping drums, laughter bubbling in signs, footsteps echoing down hallways no longer empty. The twins flourished, their bond with Amara unshakable, their father closer than ever, and though the world outside would always judge, always whisper, within those walls, they had created something stronger than prejudice. They had created a home. And perhaps, for Alexander Callahan, the man who once thought wealth was everything, this was the richest treasure of all.